So I just laid this sketch in. I start from the beginning with paint. So if I was working through a painting, generally I'll go to the site. I'll take a lot of photos, not 10 or 12, but 30, 40, 50 photos. I came back, I sort of sorted some photos I like. I'd done some loose sketches when I was there. I picked some other possibilities for color. I used those sketches that I'd done on place plus the photos to lay a sketch in on the canvas. So I'm working on a small canvas. I put an orange ground down, which is the base color. I prefer a saturated ground. And then I laid the sketch in paint. So since I've already done some iterations that I'm familiar or feel familiar with that composition, that enabled me to go right in with paint. So now I have just this basic sketch in place. I'm going to go with summer. The majority of images I had for this place were either full summer foliage, winter with snow, or autumn. So it's a place that I've gone with some frequency and I feel very comfortable. I'm going to just stick with the summer palette. So this orange is a nice base because the summer palette is going to lean into greens. The orange is the opposite spectrally, which means I am dealing with the complement. And the complement always creates some kind of vibrancy because technically your eyes are perceiving the entire color palette. So I'm just squeezing some, this is acrylic without any pigment in it. On my palette, I have a lot of puddles of glazing liquid, which is similar to the medium. The difference is if I use the glazing liquid, it slows down the entire drying process. So I go between those depending on what it is I'm trying to achieve. I'm early enough in the process that I'm not going to worry much about trying to do slow drying time. So I'm going to just start to set in where I know there's going to be this brilliant light that is more towards the back. And since I have that light mixed, I'm going to just begin. And this movement I'm doing is called scumbling. So I'm just suggesting, I'm not painting that whole area out, but I'm suggesting, and I'm not worrying about the fact that I'm painting over some of that sketch I put in place because acrylic is self-covering. And the method I use, glazing, layered method that was developed during the Renaissance, I'm not going to get all bent out of shape trying to preserve that first layer, the sketch. The sketch just gave me a framework. So now I'm going to I'm looking at that color reference from the photo, and I'm just setting some of that color in place. Okay, so, and then while I have that green out, I'm going to move to the side. I've tinted it, meaning I've added white. Anytime you add white or black, you're desaturating. You're reducing the color intensity. So I'm now mixing more blue in and making that a darker version of green because I want it to feel more organic. I tend to use ink. I don't use black. So ink is a nice way to create. It's organic, it's transparent. So I can get a kind of green that to me feels much more natural. And put a tiny bit of orange in there with the green, because that's another way that you desaturate color, meaning you're putting a tiny bit of its complement in, which neutralizes some of the intensity of the color. So now I've got this darker, and I'm not loving that color at all. So I'm going to pull more yellow into it, and I'm using a cadmium yellow dark. But I don't want it to feel quite as artificial as that felt. Better. So now I'm going to lay just what I know are going to be some of the darker greens down in the understory. Once again, I'm not getting very stressed out. I'm not trying to finish the painting in this first round. So I'm just getting some base color. Sometimes you'll hear it referred to as massing in, establishing where the masses of volume are going to be. And as I said, I'm not trying to finish the painting. So scumble a little bit of this around. Knowing that I am going to be working in this for a while. I like the entire process. So I'm not trying to finish a painting. I'm not doing any of the sort of speed painting thing. I'm not doing plein air, which in its truest sense aim to always work during the same lighting effect because you were trying to capture the very, very specific light. So if it took you 3 days working for 45 minutes, during which time that specific lighting effect happened, that's how you finish the painting. So I'm working in a method that was sort of the most traditional method for a very long time. And that is you draw your reference from being on site, but you go back and you do the work itself on, usually, I mean, in the most traditional, you did small studies on site. You did your actual sort of large scale canvas back in your studio. So now I've got some color masked in there. I'm not worrying again about trying to finish this painting. I'd roughed in some base color. I'm going to take the color that's still active on my palette that I was using when I laid in the sketch just before I turned on this camera, and add a little bit more of the acrylic polymer medium, meaning the one that thins it but continues to dry pretty fast. And all I'm going to do now is I'm going to play around a little bit with my drawing. So I'm looking at both my winter, my fall, and my summer picture. Just helps me to figure out some of the bones of what's going on in that scene. And then all I'm doing is going through and just adding very loosely, sort of redefining some of the parts of my drawing itself. And there's going to be so much happening. This is all root and wood that has collected from various times when this particular bank would have been catching debris during heavy rains. Back here to these back shores, which give me that great depth. And I'm just going to begin to suggest what I know will be cast shadows. And all I'm doing is I'm just very loosely beginning to suggest what I know will be a great deal of shadow over in this left side pool where the heavy foliage is blocking a considerable amount of the sun. So you're seeing reflected trunks, but they're sort of lost within the mass of the reflections of all of the foliage. Like I said, I'm not trying to finish the painting. I tend to go through and I'll work some of those details in advance. I know I want a lot of reflection down there. Let me turn my little timer off. So I set a timer just because I was sort of guessing about where I would be as I got the whole canvas sort of wet with this first round. So all I'm doing is I've got a nice neutral and I added a little bit of blue to it. So I'm going to just pull that through because I know I'm going to have heavy shadow coming from that bank. I'm looking at my references and I see, so there's shadows that sort of come across. All I'm doing is just, like I had done in the forest, just getting some basic value down. It's going to help me when I come back in for my sort of second round of this piece. Down here, it's definitely dark. So this is sort of going to be one of the last things I do. And then I'm going to give it a little bit of time to dry. It's acrylic. So the difference is acrylic is polymer as the suspension, that which is holding the pigment. So it dries faster than oil-based paints. And it's to the point now where there are water-based oils and there are chemical additives that make the oil paint or the acrylic paint act more like oil. So I'm sort of losing what used to be there's a strong professional, bit of a leery sort of attitude about acrylics. And I'm happy to say that seems to be waning dramatically because good pigment is good pigment and medium is medium. So at this point, I have this basic sketch in place. And here, let me get a little bit of better light on that. I don't have a professional recording environment, but hopefully you can get a sense of what now is a fairly dark underpainting. The parts are in place. Okay, so we're back for the second part. In between, if you remember where we left off, the painting had the areas massed in, or the suggestion. So the trees were there, all of the parts were in place, and I had started laying in the basic masses of the foliage. So now that's an additional 60 or 80 minutes worth of work in it. And all I did was continued what I'd started, began to define a little bit more variety within the greens, started to suggest where the planar, the surface of the water, was going to have reflection, and just began a little bit more definition of depth. Typically, a pictorial space, a painting, if you're working from observation in a realistic way, consists of foreground, those objects that are cropped and sort of there with the viewer, middle ground, generally where your focus is, and then background, which would be the greatest depth indicated in the painting. So I'm starting to define those parts. Okay, so now I'm going to keep working. Let's see if I can get this a little closer. So my goal at this point is to just keep looking at those layers of depth. And I tend to work back to front. So there's a light that is sort of filling that opening, that almost valley as the stream turns and we're looking back into the woods. So I'm going to just work into that a little bit. So I'm going to create a really nice, brilliant light tint, a really sort of electric leaf green that I'm tinting. So tinting is when you're using white with paint. Shade is when you're using ink or black with paint. Tone is when you're using both. So I want to go back here and really punch up a sense of that light So I'm just sort of bouncing my brush a little bit back in the space between those trees, taking what I already started working on, because I had begun in between since we were last looking in that first video. I already went back in there and began to pull out some of those lights. So now I'm just really, and there's some that are, and I'm not going to get all fussy, but some of the light is just because the trees tend to catch light around their edges. So the light is coming from here. It's sort of coming from back here. So a lot of the brilliance that is visible when you're looking into that layer and layer of space is that the brightest contrast, these brilliant lights, tend to sort of be outlining some of those masses of leaves. So I'm going to just bounce some of this really brilliant light back through there. Again, I'm not trying to be a human camera. I do a lot of, anybody who's worked with digital term rubber stamp, which is a tool that just keeps repeating something that's there. I'm just sort of adding these lights that I see piercing through the layers of this intermediate tree line. And then I tend to just do this with my finger. Sometimes when I teach, I just show students if they don't like the finger thing, they can just take a big unruly brush like a dagger and use a dry brush and just sort of dab in order to create that sense of an irregular repeated pattern. So I just pulled some really strong tints. Again, I'm bouncing them in those lower areas where light would be coming through. And as I'm putting them in, I'm also just sort of reinforcing how I'm putting them in, this sense that they're coming, through trees. So I'm sort of stroking them in a way. I can do it with this to show you. Color's drying really fast because right now I didn't put any medium, and medium slows the drying. There's a variety of kinds of mediums. So on my palette, all over the palette, I put this, what you can sort of see as this white goo that's all around. That is glazing liquid, which just slows down the drying and adds viscosity. So for people who like a more oily, slower dry, that's a medium. You can also use, and I have that in a small jar, just the acrylic polymer, that which is the base of the acrylic paint. I'll thin with that often if I don't need to keep working an area. Okay, so I'm just going to come down here, trying to create a little bit of a differentiation between a super brilliant light that's hitting towards the back versus that light getting a little less brilliant, I should say a little less tinted, desaturated as it moves closer to me. Meaning I'm going to use more of the pure pigment and less of the white. So I'll still have a brilliant contrast. So for example, there is a much purer sort of apple green. So it's reading as lighter, but it isn't quite so much of a desaturated tint. Desaturated color will tend to move backwards, which is something I wanted to happen down there. So I'm controlling where it is I desaturate. So I just grabbed a brush of that medium. So this can stay wet for a little bit. I don't mind because I won't be blending the way I would if I was doing a figure, but I will still be working into it. So I'm just making the choice to use some medium so that that paint stays a little bit wet, able to be manipulated, some able to be blended, worked around. So this color I'm putting in is warm. And I'm just bouncing it through. So once again, not trying to finish the painting. I'm working in a technique which I know will find me doing layers. So here's again, I love these big clunky brushes that don't give you a lot of control because I don't want this to feel overly worked or sort of precious, that it becomes, that it loses some of the sense of the space and the movement in the environment. So I don't want it to feel like a super tight little photograph. So I'm just going to add some of that, enhancing a little bit of that light that's coming through the trees. I see in these reflections. Once again, this is a big old sloppy brush, so I can just sort of drag it through. That helps to, in this case, focus the brushwork, the strokes, in a horizontal pattern that helps to reinforce the planar quality of the surface of the water. So I'm going to mix a darker green. So I just pulled some phthalo blue green. And I'm going to pull down some, for anybody who's a painter, I'm just grabbing cadmium yellow dark, sorry. And one of the difficulties, I always use ink. Ink adds a bit more of an organic quality to the green. So even though I put a little bit of it in, like sense that green better. So I'm going to just start to pull some of those contrasts through. So there's places where the leaf massing is enough that it is blocking some light and has a little bit more sense of a shadow. So again, I can take this cool brush. I could use my finger. That brush through a little bit. And I'm going to do the same thing down. Just looking at where I see some variations. And at this point, I could start to play around. There's going to be a variety of levels, and the foreground will tend to have the most clear focus, highest contrast. And I can see that there's going to be some of those. So I'm just working a little bit of it in. Once again, knowing that I'm not finishing the painting. I'm going to go through this in several different layers. So just getting some of that nice contrast in there. And these are going to be, I can add some more leaves. I can create a gesture with some of the smaller branches that are going to be tumbling through this area. And for now, since I have a color that's working really well mixed, I'm just going to use that a little bit up in here. So I'm just beginning to suggest, in this case, foreground detail, even though I'm not quite at that point where I'm ready to work all the other details in. And as I keep saying, I don't really mind if I have to keep repainting over things. Part of the goal for me in the process is that I want it to have energy. I want my brushwork to have sort of a sense of fluid movement, and I don't want it to become so stiff that you feel like you're losing some of the experience, some of the gesture, the flow of the canopy and the way the leaves fall, because it became just so tight. Okay, so I'm going to dump this because I don't need that brush to harden, and I'm not using it more right now. I'm going to pull some brilliant yellow in and move one of my greens that I have on my palette into a much lighter, still saturated, but more of a yellow green. By the way, normally I'm sitting here to paint. Normally I would be working behind me on an easel. Standing helps. This is a really small painting. Generally, I like to be able to move back and forth. It's also not unheard of, especially if I'm doing something on site, that I'll just hold a painting. So if I'm on site and I'm doing a really small panel just as a study, I'll often just hold it in my hand and do a loose study. But anyway, that idea of painting with your whole body is greatly assisted if you're not sitting. So I'm just going to put some more contrasting. So I got caught up here in this foreground, and generally, most traditional means you work background to foreground. So I sort of shifted that order because all of a sudden I'm doing things that really are later foreground kind of details. But again, as I said, I don't really mind. I rather like getting lost in the process itself. So I just mixed a slightly more intermediate, and I'm adding a little bit more specific. So I'm doing a little bit less of the random smearing and a little bit more strokes that are beginning to describe a kind of flow that I want in those, in the foliage, in the leaves. So the same thing over here. I'm going to suddenly start to just get scale very small because these would be more distant, but I want there to be a little bit of movement. I don't want it to just be a mass of color. I want there to be contrast, both contrast of hue, which is color, and contrast of value, and contrast of gesture and direction and scale. So I'm sort of thinking of all those things as I'm working. I'm trying not to, generally you're not gripping the brush much. So this brush is really loosely in my hand because I'm not working with a pencil or a pen. And I want that brush to flow and move. So I'm sort of spinning it, which is helping me to keep the paint active, and it's keeping my strokes from getting all sort of fussy and overworked. So I'm just literally bouncing to get a variety of scale. If you start to read some backgrounds, some that are going to be more foreground. And I'm going over the trunk, even the one that is the closer tree, because there are a variety of different branches. So there we go. Sort of starting to like a little bit of what's happening. Back here, this is getting a little bit more distant, so I might just bounce a little bit, because when we see a lot of clarity, the way our perception works, clarity moves something forward. Softer, more diffuse edges, lack of clarity, will push something backwards. So I want some of this detail to move within this canopy into the middle ground. So I just sort of bounce through down there. There's some distinct branches that are in front of this tree. So in some places, I'm really focusing on that. Smashing, I tend to destroy brushes because I like the effect, again, of, in this case, I can't get a lot of control out of the way I've smashed that brush. And I like that because, again, I don't want this to become fussy and feel like it is sort of overworked. Okay, so I'm just going to get some of this variety of foliage in this foreground. Not trying to paint all those leaves. I'm just trying to create a sense of the different textures. Okay, so before I switch my palette, I'm going to go back and pull a bunch of white in. So I'm making a really pale tint again. This one's going to go cool. meaning the color itself comes out of what I was mixing, which was a little bit more of a blue-green instead of a yellow-green. And that's going to be a value that will move even more to the background. So I'm just pulling a little bit of that through. And I want to create some highlights in those banks as the light's catching, because this is cooler. Cool colors also move backwards. Warm colors move forward. So I'm sort of smashing that brush again because I just want to get some of the texture. There's a whole variety of under canopy growth. It's catching lights. So I'm just going to bring some of that in. This side I haven't really been doing much, but there's also a wide variety of that under canopy. So I'm just sort of moving that brush around and trying, as I move it, to not only create some of that suggestion of contrast, but also add the gesture or that movement that tends to be going that way as the branches move away from a plant. They get thinner, the foliage is weighted, so they tend to go downward. Okay, so I'm gonna dump that brush, keep picking away a little bit at that backgrounds. I've got a whole lot of brushes, and I've probably got another off camera 1, 2, 3, 4 containers jammed full, plus a whole half the table full. So the brushes that are in front of me just happen to be the ones that I've been grabbing as I worked on this and a bigger painting that's on an easel behind me. Okay, so I'm going to now grab, this will be the last part I record, and then I'll just do more work again. So I'm making a really brilliant sky blue, the same blue that I was working there, which I happen to be using cerulean because it is a warm summer sky. And I'm going to reintroduce some of that light that I want back here as it sort of moves down. As I'm dabbing other color, I'm also, in some cases, losing some of that value contrast I want. So I'm going to just thin. I've got a pretty small brush, and I'm just going to bounce some of that white back in there, trying not to fill the whole area, just sort of allowing it to feel like the sky that is shining through that variety of canopy. Once again, trying really hard not to get all, this is not a paint by number. Nobody sees the subject I'm working from. What they see is the painting. So the painting is what I'm focused on, not whether I'm getting it exactly like the reference photos I brought back into my studio, or in many cases, the study paintings that I brought back. I see those as just my getting to know and becoming comfortable with the air, the environment, the movement, so that as I paint, it's much, much more than just painting the reference of masses and textures. It's actually trying to figure out how, as I paint, I'm also focused on the light shimmering through, the breeze moving, in this case, leaves, brilliance of a summer versus if this was a fall or a spring or winter painting. So I'm just going to get a little bit more of this. Once again, I'm making this up, not worrying about, wait, I think there was more light that was sort of a funny shape that was coming through right there. I'm just doing what I think makes sense to convey the particular sensation that I experienced and that I found to be attractive, engaging, interesting about this particular afternoon, this particular bending creek. So now that's a little more light coming down in there. Since I've got the paint mix, this nice sky, I'm just going to go ahead and pull some of it in here. Foliage is always rustling, always moving. Light is getting through in various places. Sometimes we get stuck in a schemata where we just sort of think that everything looks like that idea that we set in place when we were little kids, like, you know, trees have big popsicle masses of leaves, and then there's a large trunk that just comes down from there. The reality is they're highly irregular. There's always movement, there's always gesture. So let me just get a little bit more of this in, and then I'm going to take a look at where this is, and I'm going to keep painting. So in between these pauses, I'm also doing more work in it. So I am going to keep focusing on what it is that I've been talking about on this part of the recorded process. The difference is I'm going to do it without, I'm going to do it by myself. And I actually don't sit here and have a dialogue with myself. It's sort of going on in your head, but no, I'm not talking it off. I'm not talking through it the whole way like I am when I have an audience or a virtual audience. Okay, so now it's starting to get much more of that sense. You can see if I pull, to get a stronger light that maybe you can see it more. No, then you just see the reflection of the light. So before I go away, what I'm going to do is my very first suggestion of some of the light that is going to work on the surface. So I just put some acrylic polymer medium. I mean, this is going to dry really fast. And I'm smearing my brush and smashing it so I didn't pull any new paint into that. And I'm looking, and I can see that there's going to be this suggestion of movement in that surface of the water. So I'm just going to start the roughest suggestion of where those are going to be. So I'm smashing this brush because it opens the brush up. Terrible for brushes, but I can always buy brushes. What's much more important to me is getting the effect. So there's like reflection of the water, sky that's getting through, this movement, especially in the foreground as it gets closer to you. And I'm beginning to just suggest that. So up here, that the scale of that is a little bit too big. So all I'm going to do is bounce this brush just to pick some of that up. Same thing, I don't like that. Sometimes I'll just go right through with a brush and it's already semi-dry, but it just gave me a chance to pick up a little bit of that. So now I'm doing it. This is where I want really small scale, because this is describing something going on the surface of that water that is considerably farther away than what's happening down here. So I've got this irregular brush. And that gives me at least the beginnings. While I have this and it's still active, I'm taking brown into it. I'm going to create a tertiary, a neutral, meaning I have white, I have some black, and I have two colors at this point. And I'm going to add a third, just a little orange to warm that up and make it. I'm making these choices. This isn't necessarily exactly what I see on the photos that I have here, but it is what I want to be conveying. So I have this color. I'm going to just pull a little bit of that through while I'm at it. Water has creeks, streams, rivers, larger bodies. There's usually three things that are happening, particularly when you're looking at something like a creek or a stream. You're going to be able to see something through the shallow waters. You're going to be aware of some texture, the mud, the color. You're going to see light and shadow working within the water itself. That's just part of the surface, the water, and everything within the environment that would be casting shadow or blocking light. And then there's the colors that are reflecting in the surface of the water. So my last little thing, and then we're going to close up and I'll just work a little bit solo, is I'm going to take another fine brush. My greens are still active. I only needed a little bit of them. I'm going to take a lot of the medium again right into what is a little bit of that green that's left on this brush, because I do see some greens that are in the water. And I'm going to just very loosely just begin to suggest where some of those greens will show up here and there within those reflections. This side over here is going to be a lot of rocks, which I've really barely begun suggesting at this point. But I can see there's greens that show up. I just grabbed a soft brush. I'm just sort of moving those greens around a little bit. So at this point, I'm fairly, let's see if I can get that. There we go. So still a whole lot to do, but it's moving along. And again, I've been building predominantly back to front, thinking about light to dark. And in acrylics, just like oil, anything that's self-covering, I'm working in a lot of the darks I worked in first. And now I've been building the lights into those. Okay, so we'll see where this is after another couple hours. So this will be the last recording. Since our previous look at this painting, I've done a little bit more, not a lot, but I worked in and continued to clarify that idea that there are layers, that illusion of pictorial space is one of the goals when I'm working with a landscape. The atmospheric effect, the overall composition, the repetition of parts, all of those things that are part of crafting a composition. But in the case of color really is a strongly evocative component. And that's really where that sense of atmospheric perspective, the term for how all of the environmental and lighting effects create the illusion of depth. It's where color is really what allows that to become extremely clear. So I'm going to just sort of pick up where I left off, and I'm going to keep working. One of the things now, at this point, I want to begin to create more variety in that lighting effect. So for example, there's very strong light that is being indicated coming down through this canopy. So these trees are going to need the trunks are not going to read as these solid single colors. So I'm going to pull some possible variations of values. Since I'm not going to be doing a lot of blending, I'm using my liquid polymer instead of glazing liquid. Remember, glazing liquid adds viscosity, oily texture to the paint, and it slows the drying down. So I'm going to just create a sense that there are some areas where light is sort of penetrating that canopy and hitting the edges accenting some of the texture as well as contours of the tree. So well, I've got this mixed. I'm going to use it on a couple places so that there's some variety in the way the light is hitting these different trees. There's also places where earlier I was suggesting this variety of branches that are coming away from the main trunks. So since I have this nice color on my brush, I'm going through and just suggesting. Once again, not a camera, not interested in trying to depict exactly how this experience might be. Instead, I'm interested in conveying the sensation. So I'm adding branches that don't necessarily connect in an exact way with other parts, but it is conveying that there is a density up there of both leaves and branches that are coming from different trunks, different trees in different levels, closer, farther away. And since I have mixed this slightly lighter value, I decided that's something that works well to do that. So I'm going to cool this down a bit. The light I just mixed was relatively warm still. So I pulled a little bit of French ultramarine, a little bit of white. So now I've got a lighter, slightly cooler color. I'm going to come over here and pull some of that. Enhance some of the chord where the light might be more brilliant within some of those variations that I was already indicating. There's some really strong lights where it's not the light that's hitting the tree, it's just that the tree has a very light bark. So I'm going to re-enhance those. Some of those have been sort of buried as I've worked through this. Often when I put a color down, I'll either, as I've been saying, I'll either use my finger to sort of move through it, or I'll just pull a brush because I want that to be a little softer than it appeared. There we go. So what I'm doing with this brush when I'm bouncing it through there is not trying to erase, I'm just softening the color and pulling it in some places so that it appears that the foliage I've already begun to indicate is actually growing over some parts. And I have some images off camera over here. So I've got 4 images there from the same part of the creek. And I'm just glancing at those. Some are in fall, some are in spring or summer, but it's giving me an idea of what the coloration, the variety of some of these different birches and the different kinds of trees. Now I'm going to pull a really brilliant light because some of the trees that are in this opening are catching a really strong sense of the light as it's coming down through the trees. So I'm using a pretty brilliant light for some of those. And again, I'm using this to slightly soften those edges. I'll come up here. So this tree is big enough that when it gets up here to the top, it is catching distinctly more light. So I just added some contrast. Since I have this nice light, I'm going to take it even stronger, lighten it. It's down on the ground. This mass of roots is catching an area of pretty brilliant sunlight. So I'm just going to go through and suggest with this even stronger light some of that variety. There's some branches, some parts of that root systems are sticking out a little bit more. Same thing is happening a little bit back here. While I have this on my brush, I'm going to move back up on the palette. I still have that middle warm brown that I had mixed for some of the highlights. So I'm going to take it now to an intermediate light. I'm just going to pull that down through here in some places so that there's a sense that this mass of overlapping branches continues through that whole area. Some of it really catching light, others caught in dark shadows, and yet other parts in just a little bit less the shadow. There's some variety of ground and roots that are showing, so I'm just very, very loosely suggesting some of that. Once again, as I keep saying, I'm not trying to make this have some kind of a rendering or a connection that is slavish towards the colors and the literal way that I experience this, but instead I'm trying to convey a sensation of how that experience conveyed to me. Okay, so I'm almost ready to switch off and play around with some other colors. But since I have this on my brush, I'm going to just pull a few more of these little highlights that exist. I haven't done a lot in those rocks yet. I haven't worked back into the water. There is a warm reflection that is residing on the top of that water. It's one of the really nice illusions. Remember, you can see somewhat's on the bed of the creek. You can see the flow of the water. You can see how light is hitting the surface of the water, plus you see all the reflections of what's around the water. So this is one of those effects that's hitting the surface. So I mixed a sort of warm value. I took it semi-transparent using the medium. And I'm going to just pull that through right over top what's there, indicating some of that light that would be flooding through and hitting parts of the surface of that water. And I'm looking, I think that could use a little bit more of a sense of that honeyish kind of yellow. So made it even lighter. And I'm going to come in and just push sort of in the middle of some of that reflection that I was already indicating. And I'll grab a nice soft flat. And I'm pulling that direction of the stroke both ways. Because then when I go through it, it has this sense of a transparency that is affecting the surface of the water versus some kind of a current. And there's quite a bit of light is hitting in different places. I use that same value and just come right through some of the pattern that I was already indicating from our last round going through this. So I just did my little smashing the brush thing, and I'm going to just now much stronger like the color, but I want it now to actually convey some of the light that is hitting within flow, the pattern that's in the water itself. Okay, so now while I have that color, rocks are not gray. They're usually cool. So they have some blue, they have some brown. And since I have a lot of warm browns on my palette right now, I'm going to take advantage of that before those dry. And I'm just going to make some slightly lighter highlights, not as light as some that I'd already put in place. And I'm just going to work into those rocks and just create a little suggestion of some of the variety that is showing up. And I'm going to go really light, create some highlights. So that's a very strong value. That's again where I'd either take my finger or I'm using this brush this time. And I'm sort of bobbing and just tapping a little bit because I want that there to be a little sense of gradation in that highlight. I also want it to feel like there are places where the light is streaming down and it's not hitting consistently over all the parts. So the last thing I'm going to do before I turn off this section and then just proceed to try to complete this painting is I'm going to go back into that water. You may remember I was trying to begin capturing the sense that there is reflection of the sky that's coming down through the trees, hitting the water. So my white is polluted, so I need to put some fresh white down. Get all of that out of the brush because I like that brush. Let's try that again. So I'm going to mix towards that high contrast color that I see from the sky that is reflecting in current. So it's running with that texture of the water. I don't need this to stay wet blendable, so I'm putting in just liquid polymer, which is the base of acrylic paint. And I'm going to come back in here and I'm going to just accent some of these reflections that I already started working. So I'm using that brush that I just took and destroyed as those hairs are even coming out, somewhat in protest over the bad treatment of the brush. And the water is breaking over probably a row of rocks. They run down through there. So I'm actually going to try to capture a little bit of that in how I work this pattern. As soon as my brush starts to try to return to the shape it's supposed to have, I just smash it again. Down here where I see that highlight catching again as the water is probably hitting at another area where there are rocks within the bed of that bank itself. And these seem a little bit bright, but I don't mind that they're terribly bright because I can also pull a semi-transparent glaze over and do some places where I don't want it to be quite as bright as it is right now. So I just grab a dry, what are called daggers. Again, a brush I like because it does not lend itself to having a lot of control. So it helps me not to get too precious as I'm working. So with this nice brush load, I'm going to pull some of that brilliant green back in there that I can see is shimmering through, especially as you get toward the back there. I'm just coming in. Once again, using that. And that way that is making a little more sense to me. Just gonna focus where I see a little bit more of that happening. As I'm dabbing, as I'm pushing down on this dry brush, I'm also going in the direction that helps that light to also feel like it is traveling on the surface of that planar surface of the water. So I'll do a little bit more here, and then I think I'll give you a break from watching this. So I just took that same green that I was working with and I pulled it distinctly darker. I'm just going to use this to just here and there pull some suggestions of darker green. And then when I look, this area has gotten a little flat. This area feels a little flat, but the color that I see is definitely a tone, which means white and black are mixed in with the color. So I'm going to do a little bit of that. So I'm purposely picking up color that will read definitely a little bit more toned, or desaturated would be a synonym for toned. And that way I can see that reflection still happening over there in the shadow. And as I get in here, the shadow itself warms up. So it's still toned. I'm just adding little bits of varieties of color. Because that just keeps warming it and slightly desaturating even what's there. So now I've got a heavily desaturated grayish green light, and I'm just going to pull a little bit of that through. And I'm going to lean back and turn that camera off in one moment. But while I have that color on my brush, I just grab brown mixed with what's left in the brush. A brush load of cadmium orange. And I'm going to just pull some of that through because I see some of the pattern on the water as you get closer to the shore where it's in shadow. But it is still present. So I'm just using that nice warm brown. And I'm going to come down through here. Remember I said I can always slightly subdue that color? So the white's not going to go away. I should say that very, very pale sky blue. I just slightly cut it back. Take that same so I'm just looking down here and I see that there's definitely some of that silty, muddy bottom that is affecting the color. So since I still have it, I'm going through what I just did. And that just helps to also accent that light is not, it's getting to the water, but it's not getting to the water evenly across the entire surface. So that helps to just warm that area up. So what I'm going to do after I turn off, I'm going to clarify a little bit more over here, and I'll keep working in what might be like another 60 to 90 minutes, and this painting will be wrapped up. And I will have it with me if you happen to be watching this at the gallery exhibit.